and I'll be speaking later on. But I'd also like to introduce Miguel, who works for an organisation called Science Without Barriers, and he's going to talk to us about the work he's been doing with some deafblind students in Spain. So welcome, Miguel.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And first of all, well, thank you to Alison and the Higher Education Network, the Geological Society, for hosting us and organizing this event. But also, well, I am the one speaking here, but anyone involved in the activities we have made, they could be equally telling you their experience. And first of all, I would like to apologize, not because of American spelling, but with this translator, traitor, words that are perfectly acceptable in Spanish may not be in English, so I apologize if I use terms that I should not be using. Who are we? We are an association, non-governmental association, that was formed by a group of lecturers, professionals related to disability, psychologists, and a lot of people trying to promote inclusive science education. And not only in relation to disability, but to any person who will not have a wide access to scientific contents. Although I am going to speak about the geological part, and for most of our activities, they are related to geology, but we were called Science Without Barriers because we didn't want just to be about geology, but about science in general. And something which I think is relevant, we are focused on science public outreach, mainly. We are not talking that much about adapting a syllabus or a curriculum, but we are talking about non-formal education. So our science public outreach, it really has a social component, which is, I think, something very important, and we will see that we are like halfway reaching our objectives in that regard. While Chris has been focusing, I think, mainly on mobility issues, but one of the things, I mean, our focus has been especially on people who really need a very significant adaptation for reaching materials, not as much accessing materials from a physical point of view, but to accessing the material from either knowledge perspective or as the case Chris was commenting, because of sensory impairment. Well, this is our Facebook, and this is our website that I have to thank Chris and the International Association for Geoscience Diversity that they let us use some space for this website. What do? We do workshops with people with disabilities, we give talks as this one, and we try to organize activities that put ourselves in the shoes of someone with a disability. Also within the association, we have scientists and scholars that they disclose themselves as disabled, and for example, they are leading some projects in relation to accessibility, in this case of astronomy. And focusing on geology, as I said, this association was born around a group of geologists from the School of Geology of the Complutense University of Madrid, and it really had to do with this Innovation in Education project, GeoDivulgar, and the philosophy of it was for students to get a better understanding of geology through the involvement in science outreach activities. The case in Spain about the public perception of geology, well, it's not really the most popular science in general, and we thought it was really necessary to build strategies to disseminate geological knowledge for everyone, not only because of geology itself, but because we thought that geology was a science that has a high potential for transmitting transversal key competences for lifelong learning. And by everyone, we mean everyone. And one perspective we normally have, we are not talking about graciously giving away some of our time for people with disabilities. But we are talking about two important documents, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that says in the Article 27 that we all have the right to participate in the cultural life of the community, being science also part of the cultural life, and sharing scientific advancement. And if we look at the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we have to ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights for all those peoples for all those persons with disability. So we are not talking about something we may or we may not do, but we are talking about really fundamental rights of people. And as I said, remembering that our focus is non-formal learning, it is relatively common to find social activities and to find outings adapted for people with disabilities, but it's rare to find learning and scientific activities. And we can wonder if there is no demand for that, but we believe that it hasn't been offered, so there can be a demand when there has not been an offer. But we are also not talking, we are at first talking about science outreach activities as something that really improves quality of life for disabled people and for everyone. Because any of you who have been involved to public outreach activities, probably the first thing that came up was how, the people was like, well, this is very interesting, this is fun. We are learning something that we didn't know, and that's something very powerful from the point of view of self-esteem and self-image. But it's something also good for us, scientists, scholars, because when we are trying to communicate our science to the most basic level, to the level in which everyone can understand what we are doing, what we are explaining, we really have to go to the fundamental basis of our discipline and really, as was Chris mentioning, know if we climb a mountain just for the sake of climbing a mountain, or we really need to learn what's a contact or what's something, and the other is accessory. I say something there that I really believe our funds, most scientists and scholars are paid with public funds, and really something that we must do. We have to return to society what they are paying for. And well, science public outreach activities are really good fun. So looking at these two last slides, we have to see that adapting science outreach activities is not something optional, but it's something that we need to do, we must do. And I would like to make a small experiment. If you want to join me, on all those who can, please stand up. So you wake up a little bit. And I will ask you to sit down if any time you had to skip some field trip or you went to field work or any educational activity for this matter, and you couldn't go because you were ill or you were having any medical condition. So sit down if you were in that. I was the first one who was in this situation in my first year of my degree. Or if you were in a field trip and you said, I can't go anymore, and you felt unwell, or you felt that you were losing your breath and you couldn't go anymore, or you could not attend to a demand field trip because, for example, you were pregnant, Chris, or something, the lecturer said, here you clearly see, and you look and look and look, and you don't know what's happening. And one devoted to me, you were listening for the first time to a common geological term in a language that is not yours, and you were, I remember the first time I heard quartz said by a native speaker, and we were three of us from Spain, and it was like, rock rich in quartz, and we were like, so what? Quartz, and what's that? Quartz? So now you all can sit down, and Well, some of you really were lucky and you didn't need to have any adaptation, but to all this list, we could add that adapting fieldwork is not something for disabled people, but it's something we all benefit from it, from universal design for learning, because at some point in our life, we may not be officially disclosed as disabled persons, but as Chris was mentioning, nobody really wants to get up to a mountain just for the sake of doing that. Well, some people want to do it, but not the average student or average person. So as I said, we are having a special focus on people who need a very significant adaptation of teaching materials. And in relation to field trips, we have had field trips with people with intellectual disabilities, mostly people with Down syndrome, and people with the deaf blindness. And I would like to highlight here the potential that geology has for multisensory activities which improve the learning process, as people working in education know. And I am going to tell about experience that was partly funded by the Geological Society and Jeremy Wilson Charitable Trust, that it was a field-based geology teaching for people with the blindness in the Basque Coast Geopark in Spain. First of all, deaf blindness. Deaf blindness is not just having auditory and visual impairment. It's a disability in itself, because it's not one plus the other, but the loss of one area impacts in the loss of the other, and that's the emphasis of the combination of both. So deaf blindness is not sort of sight and hard of hearing, but it's a disability in itself. And it's a very heterogeneous group, depending on if they were born with deafness or if they were born with blindness and they acquired the other during life. The first case, the case where people are born with or acquire solely after birth blindness and deafness, it will be the most difficult one from the teaching perspective, and the activities that we have been making, they have been targeted mainly to these three groups. These groups condition the acquisition of abstract knowledge and the communication system, that it may be sign language, normal sign language, or tactile signing. That will mean that I am speaking in sign language and the other person will put his or her hands on the top and feel what I am signing, or manual alphabets, which is signing on the palm of the hand. Before this experience I'm going to mention, we had organized some workshops where we found challenges both accessing information and acquiring abstract concepts. And basically most of the things we needed to do had to be deeply tactile and very basic in terms of introducing abstract concepts that, especially for those speaking sign language, they may not exist in their mother tongue, which is sign language. So going back to this trip, these were the aims that we wanted to have to facilitate the access. That's the most important thing. Facilitating the access. Learning cannot take place if you don't have access to learning. And I am not talking about access, in this case, to the field site, but access to that material. And obviously to carry out some educational research on knowing how to improve field teaching in earth sciences when it needs adaptation to people with disabilities, and raise awareness on the reality of including people with disabilities on public awareness of science policies. And that's what we wanted them to learn. And we wanted them to understand sedimentation, to recognize sedimentary structures, and to recognize strata, and comprehend the concepts of geological time, extinction, limits, and also know about geoparks and global boundary strata type sections. So 16 of us, for people with blindness, for guide interpreters, for geologists, and for people from the general public attended to this field trip, and we went to Zumaya in the north of Spain, and we chose that because this geopark, it's really spectacular in many ways and very relevant. This is the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, and many other things, but we chose it basically because of its accessibility and also because of its tactile accessibility. The turbiditic sediments allow for the students to be able to touch strata, a lot of structures in a, let's say, in a very short space, something that you cannot do with 50 meters strata. And they are crazy about their fish, and you can find menus in restaurants, shops, everything there in Zumaya is about the fish. And it's, as I said, very, very important from the point of view of especially boundaries. That was one of the things that we wanted them to learn. So we had some preparatory workshops. Many times, as Chris was highlighting from his experience, many times what we need is not as much an adaptation of what you are doing in that moment, but to prepare materials beforehand. And that's something actually that we forget in relation to fieldworks many times, because we go directly to the field trip, and at the end we give a lecture in front of an outcrop. But people, when you see something for the first time, it takes more time to learn something that if you know exactly what you are going to see, you understand the concepts that you are going to explore in the field, in this case. And so when you are there, you are prepared, and you optimize that time of field work to actually do field work and not to explain what you would like them to see or to do. And that's something important when field work is not only when you adapt it for people with disabilities, but field work is expensive anyway. So, as we said, we had to prepare sensory materials for students to learn, for example, what was sedimentation, try to explain sedimentation to someone who cannot see or cannot hear. It's something very abstract that only by feeling what's sediment or sand falling on your hand, that when it falls vertical, all that sort of things you can really understand. And also mountains. For a person who has never perhaps been in a mountain, seen a mountain, it's really hard to understand that there can be mountains. So we prepared that material, and also rocks and trace fossils for them to touch them and to know before we really got into the field what they were going to see. And here you see, for example, the Han alphabet. So every time we were working like in groups of 3, a geologist, a guide interpreter, and the student. So there was this flow of information and adaptation as you were speaking, because most of the times the guide interpreter was saying to you, don't go through that road because, you have the challenge of the guide interpreter to understand what you are trying to say, so the guide interpreter can translate it in a way that the student can't understand, which is not just translate, but to adapt it. And as we were going to make turbidites, we prepared this very thick cold chocolate to put into a warm place with water and create a turbidite. So this water is warm, and when you add, yes, please play the video. When you add this, it creates creates a turbiditic current that it's very cold, so they could feel the current going on their hands, and understanding that there was a current within the water, and also after felt the sedimentation and how this material was falling very quickly on their hands. So after learning about these concepts through these workshops, we actually went to the strata itself. And as I said, the work was structured in groups of 3, a geologist, a guide interpreter, and a student. One challenge in here is that the guide interpreters swap after half an hour, so the student don't get used to a certain interpreter. And also, it's physically demanding for the interpreters, because you try to spell everything with your hand continuously, or speaking sign language with someone holding your hands down, so they need to change and have some rest. So yeah, that was a specific challenge. And also, as we said, people without a background in geology and without any disclosed disability were attending to the field trip and getting to know the same material. I mean, we were not explaining to them specifically anything. They were receiving the explanations the person with the blindness was receiving. And this is, for example, sign language, tactile sign language. And what we did was basically to go through the sediments and explain concepts as older, more modern, the differences in sedimentary structures, in grain size, in lithology that you can find in this section. And as we said, the fact that the strata in this section are very thin was an advantage, because you really could, it's like when you browse CDs or things like this, to go and go through the history of this section with your fingers. And obviously we brought supplementary material where that was also used on site, as for example these foam plates to explain how sediments were folding. For example, this person is a student, is studying law and business. So, I mean, he has a very high level, but for example, he found a lot of problems with horizontal and vertical. I mean, and all the whole thing of the strata being horizontal at the beginning and folding to be vertical, for him was challenging. So with the foam, we could try to explain that a little bit better. As we were on the beach, we easily could do things to explain trace fossils and how different behaviors and the superposition of trace fossils that were quite common in that section. And as I said, one of the learning objectives was to learn about global boundary stratotype sections and the golden spikes and the significance of that, the significance of protecting geological sites. So we could do that also from a tactile perspective. Here is a student touching the golden spike for the titanium. And also we wanted to have a focus on dissemination. And actually tomorrow in the Spanish National TV, there's going to be there is a program called In Sign Language, which is Saturday morning. So there's going to be a small documentary on this field trip. And what we concluded from our experience, that I rush to try to be on time, but I don't know if I am successful or not. So what we discovered that we were successful in selecting activities that were adequate for these proposed learning outcomes. And something that for me is very important, they were attractive for both people with and without deaf blindness. So everyone learned, and it was a good experience to be sure that when you adapt something to someone with a specific disability, people without that specific disability can get something out from it. And we could get this adaptation of teaching by individualizing the teaching. I mean, it was not a person teaching to many others and all these guide interpreters adapting the information to a person with the blindness, but there was a devoted educator for each person, so you could adapt your speech and your teaching to the level of that specific person, and in that way try to balance the different rhythms for learning. And as I said, all participants reached to some extent expected learning outcomes, and the general public didn't have a specific teaching, but they really were witnessing what the rest of the people were doing. And so we could say that in that sense we reached, or we accomplished, some principles of universal design for learning, because we were able to design an activity that was good for people with different learning abilities. But on the other hand, the different learning rhythms made it difficult to keep a single schedule for all. Chris was mentioning before about being flexible, trying to think of, for example, a classroom in which you had some students with some special needs. It's sometimes hard to keep we are going to do this from 10 to 2, because the different rhythms of learning sometimes make that difficult, especially if you have people from the general public involved. So something, and as we were saying, our aim, it's non-formal learning, so it has a social perspective, and learning has a social perspective, and Chris was talking before about learning communities, but what we learned is that the specific characteristics of the blindness made almost impossible any social interaction beyond the educator teaching whatever they were teaching in that moment, because, I mean, you can't do, if you don't have this kind of disability, you are maybe looking to those rocks, and you can comment with the other student, and you can have a question, and you see that someone else is over there, and that extends also to other moments of the day where you could have had social interaction, as it is meals, or when we were walking from one side to the other. So something that we learn is that when you do these activities from the point of view of non-formal learning, and what you really want to have is an inclusiveness, you really have to schedule also times. You have to schedule times for learning and times for social interaction, because if not, we get to this point instead of this one. So we reach a point in which we adapted material for people with a disability that were included in a, let's say, group without a disability. But we didn't reach to the point of having a mixed learning community between people with and without disability in this case. Because, and I will answer to the questions, or give my opinion to the questions given before, I think the disclosure of the disability is not as important as to know the requirements of that disability, not because of a thing of political correctness, but because, and that's, I think, a very big risk when speaking about these things, you don't know what the other person needs. And if you say, I have, I don't know, deaf blindness, I couldn't have thought before this experience that the person needed one time to learn, one time to tell me how's life. So it's only the person with a disability or a special need or whatever you want to call it who can tell you, I need this and this. And labels sometimes prevent us to know what the other person really is needing, because you may have the Gomez syndrome, but what's that? What do you need? What kind of adaptation do you need? And I think the European Observatory of Disabilities says nothing for us without us. And sometimes when we try to adapt things, we focus too much on our good intentions and we forget what the other person is really needing or not. So, well, thank you all very much, and thank you to all the people who made possible our activities and this specific activity. And if you have any question, please ask.